He laughed at my paycheck in front of his entire office, called me his cute little charity case, and told his boss that marrying me was the one financial mistake he couldn't undo. What he didn't know was that 3 floors above him, in a boardroom he'd never been invited into, 12 lawyers were waiting for my signature to hand me control of a company worth more than his entire firm could earn in 100 lifetimes. He humiliated me for being poor on the exact same afternoon I became one of the wealthiest women in the country. And the worst part is, I let him keep talking. I wanted to hear exactly how far he'd go before the truth came out. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why silence can be the most powerful weapon a woman ever learns to use. If this story pulls you in, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens in the next 20 minutes will make you rethink everything you assume about the people closest to you. My name is Adrienne Voss Calloway, and for 6 years, I built my entire identity around being quiet, being modest, and making myself small enough to fit into a marriage that was never built to hold me. I worked as a junior archivist at a private university library in Chicago, cataloging donated manuscripts and restoring fragile documents that most people would never think twice about. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't well paid, but I loved it. There was something about holding a 200-year-old letter in gloved hands and knowing I was the reason it would survive another century. My salary was modest by any measure, especially compared to my husband's world. Bennett Calloway was a managing director at one of the city's most aggressive investment firms. He wore tailored suits that cost more than my monthly rent used to be back before we got married. He measured people in net worth the way other people measured the weather, automatically, constantly, without even realizing he was doing it. When we met, he told me my quiet nature was refreshing. 6 years later, he told his colleagues it was because I didn't have much to say for myself. I noticed the shift slowly. It's always slow. Nobody wakes up one day, suddenly married to contempt. It arrives in small doses, disguised as jokes, disguised as concern, disguised as love that has simply matured. At first, it was little comments about my clothes. They became little comments about my job. Then, somewhere in year 4, it became something else entirely. It became performance. He started saying these things in front of people. At dinner parties, at his firm's holiday functions, in front of his mother. She catalogs old paper for a living, he told his colleagues once, laughing, swirling his drink. I keep telling her there's no ceiling in that career because there's no career. I laughed along. I always laughed along. I told myself it was easier than the alternative, which was watching the room go quiet and watching him get defensive, which always somehow ended with me apologizing for making things awkward. What Bennett never knew, what nobody in his world knew, was that my last name wasn't originally the one on our marriage license. Voss was my mother's maiden name, the name I used professionally out of some old, complicated instinct I never fully explained to him. He assumed it was a quirky hyphenation thing writers and academics do. He never asked further. He never had a reason to. He never asked because he never wondered who I actually was. He had already decided, the day we met, exactly what kind of woman I would always be to him. Small, modest, grateful. A woman he could use to make himself feel generous every time he paid for dinner. He had no idea that 1,500 miles away, in a private hospital room in Geneva, an 81-year-old man named Julian Voss was drawing his last breaths, and that everything he had spent 60 years building was about to fall directly into my hands. I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in 11 years. The estrangement wasn't dramatic, not in the way people imagine. There was no explosive fight, no scene at a dinner table. It was quieter than that, and somehow crueler. My mother had walked away from the Voss family when I was 19, tired of the way wealth had hollowed out every relationship in that house, tired of watching her own father treat people like line items on a balance sheet. She took me with her, and for over a decade, we built a life that had nothing to do with Voss dynamics, the logistics and pharmaceutical empire my grandfather had spent his entire adulthood assembling. I grew up believing that was the right choice. I still believe it, even now. But choices like that have consequences you can't always predict, and mine were about to detonate in ways I never saw coming. 3 weeks before that hospital room in Geneva went silent, I received a call from a woman named Priscilla Wentworth. She introduced herself as senior counsel to the Voss Family Trust. Her voice was calm, careful, the kind of voice trained specifically to deliver information most people aren't emotionally prepared to receive. She told me my grandfather was gravely ill. She told me he had been asking for me. And then she told me something that made my hands go cold around the phone. She told me I needed to come to Geneva immediately because there were decisions that couldn't wait, decisions that involved documents with my name already printed on them. I didn't tell Bennett the full truth. I told him I had a family emergency, and I rarely mentioned someone dying overseas. He barely looked up from his laptop. He said, "Take whatever time you need," in the same tone he used when the dry cleaner called about a missing button. He didn't ask questions because he had never been curious about my family. To him, my family was a small, unremarkable footnote in a life he considered himself the main character of. If he had asked even one real question, everything might have unfolded differently. But he didn't. And so I boarded a flight alone, carrying a secret I didn't even fully understand yet myself. The moment I walked into that hospital room and saw my grandfather, thin and pale against white sheets, something inside me cracked open. 11 years of silence collapsed in an instant. He reached for my hand before I even reached his bedside, and he said 4 words that would rearrange the rest of my life. "You were always right." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. He was too weak to explain fully, drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and uneven. But over the next several days, sitting beside him in that quiet room, I began to understand pieces of a much larger story. He told me he had watched from a distance for years, quietly, through people I never knew existed. He knew about my work at the library. He knew about my marriage. He knew far more about Bennett than I ever imagined possible. And he told me something that made the blood drain from my face. He told me that 3 years earlier, Bennett had reached out to Voss Dynamics directly, attempting to position his firm for a lucrative advisory contract on an upcoming acquisition, completely unaware that the family he was trying to court financially was the same family his wife had walked away from as a teenager. My grandfather had recognized the last name Calloway instantly. He had quietly, deliberately, made sure the deal never happened. Not out of spite, he told me, but because he didn't trust a man who would try to profit off a company without ever once mentioning it to the woman he shared a bed with. I sat there in stunned silence, replaying every conversation Bennett and I had ever had about his work, searching for a moment when he might have mentioned the name Voss. There wasn't one. Whatever ambition drove that pitch, he had kept it entirely separate from our marriage, the same way he kept most of his real self separate from me. My grandfather passed away 6 days after I arrived. I held his hand when it happened, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, even sitting in that sterile hospital room, grieving a man I barely knew anymore, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen. The will reading happened 4 days later, in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of Voss Tower, 40 stories above the streets of Geneva. I sat at a long table surrounded by people I didn't recognize, distant cousins, board members, executives who had spent decades building the empire my grandfather left behind. Priscilla Wentworth stood at the head of the table with a leather folder in her hands, and when she opened it, the room went completely silent. My grandfather had left 91% of Voss Dynamics, a global conglomerate spanning pharmaceuticals, logistics, and renewable infrastructure, valued at just over $100 billion entirely to me. Not to his 3 surviving children. Not to the cousins who had spent their lives circling him for favor. To me, the granddaughter who had been gone for 11 years. The granddaughter who cataloged old letters for a living and drove a car with over 90,000 miles on it. There was a letter attached to the will, written in his own unsteady handwriting, and Priscilla read it aloud. He wrote that everyone else at that table had spent their lives chasing his money, and that I was the only person who had ever walked away from it. He wrote that walking away was the only proof he ever needed that I could be trusted with it. I sat there frozen, staring at numbers that didn't feel real, while distant relatives around that table stared at me with expressions I couldn't quite name. Some looked stunned. Some looked furious. One of my grandfather's nephews, a man named Desmond Voss, who had spent 15 years working his way up through the company finance division, looked like he wanted to set the entire building on fire. On the flight home, I sat by the window with the folder of documents pressed flat against my lap, unable to make myself open it again. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I found myself thinking not about the money, but about my mother, about the life she had built for us on purpose, deliberately smaller and quieter than the one she'd walked away from. I wondered what she would think, watching her daughter inherit the very thing she had spent a decade trying to escape. Somewhere over open ocean, I made a quiet promise to myself. Whatever came next, I would not let $100 billion turn me into someone my mother wouldn't recognize. I flew home 4 days later, carrying documents that would legally transfer control of a $100 billion empire into my hands within 90 days, pending a mandatory transition period. I hadn't told Bennett a single word about any of it, partly because I was still in shock, partly because some quiet, guarded part of me needed to understand what this meant before I let anyone else near it. I walked back into my apartment, expecting comfort. What I got instead was a preview of exactly who my husband really was. Bennett was hosting a small gathering that night. 3 of his colleagues from the firm and their wives, something he'd apparently forgotten to mention while I was overseas burying my grandfather. I walked in still carrying jet lag and grief, and he looked at me like I was an inconvenience arriving 15 minutes before dinner reservations. "Oh, good, you're back," he said, not asking how the funeral went, not asking if I was okay. "Can you at least look presentable? Marcus and his wife are coming in 20 minutes. I stood in the doorway of my own home, still processing the fact that I had just become one of the wealthiest women on the continent, and my husband was worried about whether my travel clothes were embarrassing him in front of coworkers. That dinner became one of the most surreal nights of my life. Marcus Delacroix, one of Bennett's senior colleagues, was there with his wife, a woman named Simone who worked in private wealth management. The conversation drifted, as it always did in that world, toward money, toward portfolios, toward bonuses, toward whose firm had landed which client that quarter. And then, because he apparently thought it was charming, Bennett brought up my job. "Adrienne restores old paper for a living," he said, laughing lightly, refilling his wine glass. "Very noble, very unprofitable." Marcus chuckled politely. Simone gave me a sympathetic look that somehow felt worse than if she'd laughed too. "I keep telling her she should have studied finance," Bennett continued, clearly enjoying himself now. "At least then, one of us would understand a balance sheet." Simone tried to change the subject, asking politely about the manuscripts I worked on, but Bennett wasn't finished. He turned to Marcus with the easy confidence of a man performing a bit he'd rehearsed 100 times before. "You should see her office," he said. "Cardboard boxes. Fluorescent lighting." I offered to introduce her to some people at the firm, get her something with actual growth potential, but she liked her little paper museum too much. He laughed at his own joke, and Marcus laughed with him, the practiced laugh of a man agreeing with his boss's dinner table opinions. I sat there with a glass of water in my hand, $100 billion transfer of ownership sitting and signed in a folder inside my closet, and I said absolutely nothing. Not because I had no response, because for the first time in 6 years, I understood something with total clarity. I understood that whatever I said next would matter more than anything I had said in this marriage before. So I smiled and let him keep talking. Over the following weeks, I began quietly working with Priscilla's office on the transition. There were confidentiality agreements, board briefings, security protocols I'd never imagined needing in my life. I was assigned a small executive team to help me understand the company's structure. I spent late nights on video calls learning about supply chains, pharmaceutical patents, and logistics networks spanning 6 continents. I told Bennett these late calls were freelance archival consulting work, extra income from museum project. He barely registered the explanation. He was too busy telling colleagues about a promotion he was chasing, one that would finally, in his words, get us into a real tax bracket. The irony of that sentence still sits with me. During this period, something else began to surface, something I hadn't expected to find. While reviewing old internal communications as part of my onboarding, one of the compliance officers flagged an email chain from 3 years earlier for my review. standard procedure for any historical correspondence involving external firms that had approached Voss Dynamics for partnerships. My stomach dropped when I saw the sender's name. It was Bennett, the same pitch my grandfather had mentioned in that hospital room. But this email chain included something my grandfather hadn't lived to tell me about. In it, Bennett had specifically instructed his junior associate not to mention his marriage during outreach, writing, quote, "No need to complicate the pitch with personal details that don't add value." He had actively hidden our marriage from a potential business opportunity because he judged it as having no value to offer. I read that email 3 times before closing the laptop. It wasn't rage I felt first. It was clarity, a slow, sharpening clarity about exactly how small a role I had always played in the architecture of his ambitions. I wasn't a partner in his mind. I was a variable he managed, minimized, and occasionally apologized for. In the weeks leading up to that dinner, financial journalists had turned the mystery of my grandfather's heir into something of a public guessing game. Bloomberg ran a piece speculating the company would be sold to a Singaporean holding group. A smaller trade outlet claimed, incorrectly, that a private equity consortium had already quietly purchased a controlling stake. None of them were close, but the speculation created a strange kind of pressure around the entire transition, one that eventually reached people I never expected it to touch. One evening, I came home to find Bennett unusually attentive, pouring me a glass of wine before I'd even taken off my coat, asking about my day with a warmth that felt oddly rehearsed. It took me a few minutes to realize why. A colleague of his, someone connected to a rival investment group circling the Voss Dynamics speculation, had mentioned over drinks that whoever eventually controlled that company would be worth cultivating early, before the transition became public. Bennett, ever alert to opportunity, had apparently spent the evening wondering aloud to his colleague whether his wife's mysterious family emergency in Geneva might somehow be connected. He never asked me directly. He was too careful, too calculating for that. Instead, he simply started paying more attention to me than he had in years, refilling my glass, complimenting a dress he'd criticized months earlier, asking gentle, probing questions about my trip that I answered as vaguely as I could manage. I remember sitting across from him that night, watching him perform warmth for the first time in longer than I could recall, and feeling something harden quietly inside my chest. He wasn't suddenly curious about me. He was suddenly curious about what I might be worth. The formal transition of ownership was scheduled to be finalized at a private board dinner in New York, an event that would also serve as my first public appearance as majority shareholder and incoming chairwoman of Voss Dynamics. Priscilla had arranged everything with careful discretion. Very few people outside the board knew the identity of the new controlling owner. The financial press had been speculating for weeks about who would inherit Julian Voss's empire, publishing theories about foreign investment groups, private equity buyers, even a rumored sale to a competitor. Nobody had guessed the truth. Nobody had guessed it would be a quiet archivist from Chicago. I told Bennett I had a work event in New York, a museum fundraiser requiring formal attire. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he seemed genuinely interested, mostly because Marcus mentioned there might be finance industry people at museum things, and Bennett, ever the opportunist, decided to come along, hoping to make a few connections. I let him come. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, the part still healing from years of being made to feel small, wanted him standing in that room when the truth was finally spoken aloud. The dinner was held in a private space on the top floor of a hotel overlooking Central Park, the kind of room where each table setting alone probably cost more than my monthly salary used to be. Bennett wore his best suit, working the room the moment we walked in, shaking hands with strangers, dropping his firm's name into every introduction like a business card. He had no idea that half the people in that room were Voss Dynamics board members waiting for me. Priscilla found me near the entrance, her expression calm but purposeful. "It's time," she said quietly. "The board would like to formally welcome you." I watched confusion cross Bennett's face as Priscilla guided me toward the small stage at the front of the room, not toward some quiet corner conversation, but directly to a podium where a microphone had been set up. The chairman of the board, A soft-spoken man named Harold Reyes, who had worked alongside my grandfather for over 3 decades, stepped up first. He spoke briefly about Julian Voss's legacy, about the unprecedented decision to transfer controlling ownership outside the traditional family hierarchy, about the board's full confidence in the incoming chairwoman. And then he said my name. Please join me in welcoming Adrienne Voss, incoming chairwoman and majority shareholder of Voss Dynamics. I have never in my life heard a room go so silent so quickly. I looked out across a sea of stunned faces, executives whispering to each other, journalists near the back suddenly scrambling for their phones. And then my eyes found Bennett, standing near the bar with a half-raised glass, his face frozen in an expression I had genuinely never seen on him before. Pure, unfiltered disbelief. I walked to that podium in a dress that cost less than his monthly car payment, in front of a room full of people who now understood, in real time, that the woman he'd spent years calling unprofitable had just become the controlling owner of a $100 billion empire. I kept my remarks brief. I spoke about my grandfather, about legacy, about the responsibility of stewarding something built across generations. I did not mention my husband once. I didn't need to. The silence where his name should have been said everything necessary. After the applause faded and the room slowly returned to its usual hum of conversation, I found Bennett standing exactly where I'd left him, still holding that same half-empty glass, his knuckles white around the stem. "You could have told me," he said, his voice low, strained, somewhere between anger and disbelief. "I could have," I said calmly. "But you never asked." He tried a different approach, almost immediately, the way people do when panic replaces pride. His tone shifted, softened, took on the careful warmth of someone recalculating an entire relationship in real time. "Adrienne, this changes things. This is incredible. We should talk about how to restructure our finances, maybe bring in some of my colleagues to help manage." "There's no our finances to restructure, Bennett," I said. "There never really was. You made that very clear every time you called my income a joke in front of your friends." His face flickered through several emotions at once: embarrassment, calculation, something dangerously close to desperation. Marcus and Simone had drifted closer, close enough to hear, and I watched Bennett notice that, watched him recalibrate his performance for an audience one final time. "People change," he said quietly, almost pleading. "I can change." "You didn't know I was worth anything an hour ago," I said. "So tell me honestly, Bennett, what exactly changed?" He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in 6 years of marriage, I watched him search for words and come up completely empty. "I was just teasing," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You know, I never meant any of that seriously." "You said it in front of your boss," I replied. "You said it at your mother's birthday dinner. You said it 3 weeks ago at our own dinner table, in front of Marcus, right here." I glanced toward Marcus, who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. "I don't think teasing happens that consistently, that publicly for 6 years." Something shifted in the air between us. I could see him understanding, perhaps for the first time in our marriage, that I had been paying far closer attention than he ever gave me credit for. By the next morning, the story had already broken across every major financial outlet. Headlines speculated about the mystery heiress, who had quietly stepped out of obscurity to take control of one of the largest conglomerates in the world. A few outlets, digging further, uncovered details of my modest career at the library, framing it as an inspiring rags-to-riches narrative that had nothing to do with rags at all, since I had simply been living the ordinary, unremarkable life I chose for myself. Marcus called Bennett twice that morning, according to a message I later saw flash across his phone screen while we sat, still technically married, in strained silence over breakfast. I didn't ask what was said. I didn't need to. I could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the way he suddenly seemed to be recalculating every conversation we'd ever had, wondering how much of what he'd said over the years had been quietly filed away somewhere, waiting. Over the following days, Bennett's behavior swung wildly between two extremes. There were moments of desperate, performative affection, gestures he'd never bothered with before, flowers, apologies, promises to be different. And then there were moments where the mask slipped entirely, where I caught him on the phone with his mother, describing our marriage as an investment that had finally matured, language so cold it barely registered as human. I let it play out. I wanted to see, with total clarity, exactly what kind of man I had actually married, now that the calculation had changed. The answer arrived 9 days later, in the form of a confidential document that landed on my desk from the compliance team. Standard procedure for any employee or spouse of an employee interacting with company assets. It was a request, filed through his firm, for Bennett to be considered as a financial advisor to the Voss Family Trust. Filed under his own name. Filed without telling me. He had gone around me directly to board members he'd met at that dinner, pitching himself as uniquely positioned to manage my transition into wealth because, and I'm quoting the memo directly, he understood my background and blind spots better than any outside advisor could. He hadn't asked me. He hadn't discussed it with me. He had simply assumed that access to me was access to the company, and that his marriage, the same marriage he'd mocked for 6 years, was now a business asset to be leveraged. I met with Priscilla and Harold Reyes the following morning. I authorized the board to formally decline any advisory role for Bennett or his firm, citing an obvious and irreconcilable conflict of interest. I did not do this out of spite. I did it because somewhere in that hospital room in Geneva, my grandfather had trusted me because I had once walked away from money entirely. And I understood, finally, completely, that trust like that only means something if you're willing to protect it, even from the people closest to you. I filed for divorce 12 days after the board dinner. Bennett's reaction was, in its own way, the most honest thing he'd ever shown me. Gone were the flowers and soft apologies. In their place came lawyers, aggressive ones, filing motions I hadn't anticipated, all of it built around a single argument. He claimed that because our marriage had technically still been active during the period of my inheritance and the early stages of transition, he was entitled to significant marital assets tied to the company. I want to be clear about something here, because I know some of you are wondering. The prenuptial agreement we signed 6 years earlier, at his insistence, ironically, protected exactly none of what he was now trying to claim, because at the time we signed it, neither of us had any reason to believe either of us would inherit anything close to what I now controlled. His legal team argued around technicalities, claiming that marital contribution extended to emotional labor and household partnership regardless of financial documentation, an argument that might have gained some sympathy in a different courtroom, with a different history behind it. My legal team, backed by the full resources of a $100 billion company's counsel, dismantled those arguments with a precision that would have made my grandfather proud, entering into evidence years of internal firm communications, dinner party recollections from witnesses like Simone, and the email chain Bennett had once written dismissing our marriage as having no value to offer a business pitch. It is a strange kind of justice, watching someone's own words, spoken carelessly years earlier, become the exact evidence that unravels their legal strategy in the present. During the deposition process, something else surfaced, something that finally closed the door on any lingering doubt I might have had about walking away. Financial records requested during discovery revealed that Bennett had, in fact, been quietly building a separate investment account for over 2 years, funded partially through undisclosed bonuses he had never mentioned to me, structured specifically, according to his own financial advisor's notes, to remain protected in the event of what the advisor termed marital instability. He had been preparing an exit strategy from our marriage long before he had any idea I was worth anything at all. He simply assumed, when that day eventually came, that he would be the one walking away with leverage. He never imagined it would be me holding all of it instead. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Bennett received exactly what our original agreement specified, nothing tied to Voss dynamics, nothing beyond what he had personally earned during our marriage. He moved out of our apartment on a Tuesday morning while I was in a board meeting reviewing quarterly logistics reports for a pharmaceutical distribution network spanning 14 countries. I remember exactly where I was sitting when Priscilla texted me that the movers had confirmed his exit. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, just quiet, steady peace. In the months that followed, I threw myself into learning the company my grandfather built, meeting with division heads across 3 continents, sitting in rooms with people who had built entire careers inside Voss Dynamics before I ever set foot in one of its buildings. I made mistakes. I asked questions that probably sounded naive to executives who'd spent decades in that world. But slowly, carefully, I began to understand not just the mechanics of the business, but the responsibility of it. Thousands of employees depended on decisions I now had the power to make. That weight settled into me differently than any inheritance number ever could. I kept my job at the library for another 6 months after the divorce was finalized. Not because I needed the income anymore, but because I needed something familiar to hold on to while everything else in my life transformed. My colleagues there never treated me differently once word eventually got out, and I've always loved them for that. To them, I was still just Adrienne, the woman who spent her lunch breaks reading fragile letters nobody else wanted to touch. Desmond Voss, the cousin who had looked so furious at the will reading, attempted a quiet campaign among distant relatives to contest the inheritance in court, arguing that my 11-year absence from the family disqualified me from proper stewardship. The case went nowhere. My grandfather's letter, read aloud that day in Geneva, had been remarkably specific, remarkably legally airtight, as though he had anticipated exactly this challenge and built his final wishes to survive it. Desmond eventually accepted a senior operations role within one division of the company, a role he still holds today, and to his credit, once the dust settled, he became one of the board members I trust most. I met Theodore Ainsworth almost a year after the divorce at a renewable infrastructure conference in Lisbon, of all places. He ran a mid-sized engineering firm that Voss Dynamics was considering as a supply partner. He had no idea who I was when we first spoke, mistaking me for a junior analyst reviewing conference materials near the coffee station. We talked for almost 40 minutes before either of us mentioned our actual roles. When I finally told him I was chairwoman of the company his firm was hoping to partner with, he laughed, genuinely embarrassed, and said he owed me an apology for rambling about supply chain logistics like I was some intern. I told him not to apologize. I told him it was the first real conversation I'd had in over a year where nobody was performing for an audience, where nobody was calculating what I could offer them before deciding how much attention I deserved. We've been together for 8 months now. He has never once asked about the company's valuation. He has, however, asked me detailed questions about 18th century manuscript restoration techniques, purely because he remembered, months later, one offhand comment I made about my old job at that first dinner in Lisbon. That kind of attention, quiet, consistent, uninterested in leverage, was something I had genuinely never experienced before. Voss Dynamics crossed a new valuation milestone last quarter, driven largely by an expansion into sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing that I personally championed against some initial board resistance. It felt strange watching that number appear in financial reports, knowing that 6 years ago, the man I married once told a room full of his colleagues that I had no real ceiling to my career because I had no real career at all. I think about that sentence sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Bennett never once wondered who I really was, and in failing to wonder, he revealed exactly who he really was instead. He measured my worth entirely by a number on a paycheck, never imagining there might be an entire history behind that number he had never bothered to ask about. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that contempt always reveals itself eventually, usually right before the truth arrives to make it unforgettable. Bennett didn't lose access to $100 billion because I inherited it and hid it from him. He lost access to it the moment he decided, 6 years earlier, that I wasn't worth asking real questions about. Wealth doesn't create character. It only removes the excuses people use to hide the character they already had. I kept the last name Voss after the divorce, not as a statement, but because it was always mine to begin with. My grandfather once told me, in that quiet hospital room in Geneva, that walking away from money was the only proof he ever needed that I could be trusted with it. I understand now what he meant. Real worth was never something Bennett could see, because real worth was never something he knew how to look for. He spent 6 years measuring me by a salary, completely unaware that the woman across the dinner table from him was worth more than he could have imagined, not because of what she would eventually inherit, but because of who she had always chosen to be, long before any of it arrived. Last month, I stood in front of nearly 400 employees at our largest logistics hub outside Rotterdam, cutting the ribbon on a new training center funded through a foundation I established in my grandfather's name. Watching those workers, people who had spent decades keeping this company running while family members like Desmond and executives like Bennett circled its wealth from a distance, I understood something my grandfather must have known all along. A company like this was never really about the number attached to it. It was about the thousands of ordinary lives quietly, depending on someone at the top, making decisions with actual care. I think about the version of myself who sat silently at that dinner table for 6 years, smiling politely while being told, again and again, that she had no real value. I don't feel anger toward her anymore. I feel something closer to protectiveness. She was gathering evidence the whole time, even when she didn't know it. She was learning exactly who she had married, one careless comment at a time, until the day finally came when the truth could no longer be dismissed as a joke. Bennett still works at his firm, as far as I know. I heard, secondhand, through Marcus, that he tells a very different version of our story now, one where the timing was simply unfortunate, where he never really meant the things he used to say. I don't feel the need to correct that version for him. Some people only ever learn to recognize the worth of what they lost after it's already gone, and even then, some of them still don't learn it at all. As for me, I kept the last name Voss.